Marcus, a 15-year-old boy and the son of Crestwood's newly appointed police chief, was making his way to his grandma's house in Maplewood. It was his favorite place to visit, a home that always smelled like fresh cookies and felt like a warm hug wrapped around his soul. His grandma had a way of making him feel like the most important person in the world. Whether it was through stories of her younger days, encouraging him to chase his dreams, or sneaking him a couple of cookies before dinner when he'd had a tough day, she always had a way of lifting his spirits. As Marcus walked through the familiar streets, a sense of calm washed over him, the kind he only felt on the way to her cozy house. But today, something felt off. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed two police officers walking behind him, their pace slow and deliberate. At first, Marcus didn't think much of it. Maplewood was the kind of place where things stayed quiet, and police presence usually meant safety. But as he continued down the sidewalk, he realized the officers weren't just passing through, they were following him. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, their gazes locked on him, sharp and uninviting. The expressions on their faces were stern, almost harsh, and Marcus felt a twinge of unease creep into his chest. Their stares carried a weight that made his steps falter. He swallowed hard, his heartbeat quickening, and decided to pick up the pace. But as he moved faster, so did the officers. They matched his stride as if closing in on him deliberately. His calm was gone now, replaced by a growing knot of fear. Trying to steady his shaking hands, Marcus pulled his phone from his pocket. He dialed his dad, Chief Samuel Carter, knowing his father would know what to do. His dad had always told him to call if he ever felt uncomfortable or unsafe. That advice rang in his ears now, more urgent than ever. The officers were only a few steps behind him when one of them called out, "Hey, kid!" The tone was rough, void of kindness, and sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. "Where do you think you're going?" Marcus turned to face them, forcing himself to keep his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling under the surface. "To my grandma's house," he said. "She lives just up the street." He gestured ahead, hoping they'd recognize the neighborhood and leave him alone. But they didn't. Instead, their questions came fast and sharp, piling on top of each other before Marcus could even answer. Why was he in this area? Did he have anything suspicious on him? Could he prove his identity? His head spun as he tried to keep up. He didn't understand why this was happening. All he was doing was walking to see his grandma, yet these officers seemed to treat him like he'd done something wrong. One of them stepped closer, his hand moving toward Marcus's pocket. "What's in there?" he demanded. "It's just a gift for my grandma," Marcus stammered, pulling out the small, neatly wrapped box. Inside was a scarf he'd saved up to buy for her, a little surprise he'd been excited to give her. But his explanation didn't seem to matter. Without warning, the officer reached into his pocket, searching through it as if expecting to find something incriminating. The invasion felt humiliating, like a spotlight had been turned on him in the worst way. Marcus clenched his fists at his sides, staring down at the ground as his heart pounded in his chest. Why was this happening? Why couldn't they just let him go? He looked around, hoping his dad would show up soon. The knot in his stomach grew tighter with each passing second. The world around him blurred, the comforting image of his grandma's house fading under the weight of fear and confusion. All he could do now was wait. At the Crestwood precinct, Chief Samuel Carter's phone buzzed on his desk. Seeing Marcus's name flash on the screen sent a jolt through him. Marcus hardly ever called during the day, especially when he was on his way to his grandmother's house. Something wasn't right. He picked up, and the moment he heard Marcus's voice, his stomach tightened. Marcus tried to stay calm as he explained the situation, but the fear in his tone was unmistakable. Without wasting another second, Chief Carter grabbed his keys and rushed out the door, his mind racing as he sped toward Maplewood. Back on the street corner, Marcus stood frozen as the officers continued their barrage of questions. Officer Mitchell, the older and more imposing of the two, leaned closer, his expression cold and unyielding. "Kid, People like you don't just wander around here for no reason, he said, his words laced with suspicion. Marcus swallowed hard, his hands trembling at his sides. "No, sir, I'm not carrying anything," he managed to say, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. Officer Barnes, the younger of the two, stood off to the side, his arms crossed. He glanced nervously between Marcus and Mitchell, as if unsure whether to step in or stay silent. The tension in the air was thick, and Marcus felt the weight of their stares pressing down on him. Just as Officer Mitchell opened his mouth to fire another question, Marcus caught sight of a familiar car pulling up to the curb. Relief washed over him as he watched his father step out, his stride purposeful and his expression unreadable. The officers turned to face Chief Carter, their postures stiffening as they realized who he was. Marcus's father stopped in front of them, his gaze moving from his son to the officers with a sharpness that could cut through steel. "Would someone like to explain what's happening here?" Chief Carter asked, his tone calm but laced with authority that demanded an answer. Mitchell hesitated, the confidence draining from his face. "Chief, we thought he looked suspicious," he said awkwardly, his voice faltering. "Didn't seem like he belonged here." Carter's jaw tightened, and his voice dropped a notch, quiet but dangerous. "Suspicious?" He glanced at Marcus, then back at the officers. "You thought my son, walking to his grandmother's house, was suspicious. This is his neighborhood. This is where his family lives, and you decided he was a threat?" Barnes shifted uncomfortably, looking anywhere but at the chief. Mitchell stammered, "We didn't know he was your son, sir." "That's exactly the problem," Carter shot back, his voice sharp and deliberate. "You didn't know, because you didn't bother to find out. You didn't ask him who he was. You didn't ask where he was going. Instead, you assumed, and you treated him like a criminal." The silence that followed was deafening. The two officers stood rooted in place, their discomfort visible under the weight of Chief Carter's words. Finally, Barnes looked down at his shoes and muttered, "Oh, we messed up, sir. I'm sorry." Carter's piercing gaze landed on him, then shifted back to Mitchell. "A mistake," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "This isn't just a mistake. It's a failure to serve this community with respect and fairness. Our job is to protect, not intimidate." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "There will be consequences for this. Do I make myself clear?" Both officers nodded, their faces pale and remorseful. Carter placed a steady hand on Marcus's shoulder and guided him toward the car. "Come on, son," he said, his voice softening. As they drove away, Marcus glanced back at the street corner, his emotions a mix of relief and frustration. His dad had stood up for him, but the experience left a sour taste in his mouth. If this could happen to him, he wondered, how many others had been through the same thing? Later that evening, the family sat around the dinner table. Marcus's mother, Laura, listened intently as Carter recounted what had happened. Her face was a mask of worry, her hands clenching the edge of her chair as he spoke. When the story was finished, Laura turned to Marcus, her voice gentle but firm. "Marcus, sweetheart, I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said. "You did nothing wrong. None of this was your fault." Marcus nodded, but the knot in his chest hadn't loosened. "Mom, Dad," he said, looking between them. "Why did they think I didn't belong? I was just walking. Why was that enough for them to stop me?" Carter sighed, his expression heavy with a mix of sadness and resolve. "Son," he said, "sometimes people make decisions based on their own biases, not the truth. It's wrong and it's unfair, but it happens. That's why we have to stand up for what's right." Marcus looked down at his plate, the weight of the day still lingering, but as his dad's words settled in, he felt a spark of determination. Maybe this was a lesson not just for the officers, but for him too. Well, do people treat me like I'm dangerous? I was just walking to Grandma's, but those cops looked at me like I was some kind of criminal. Marcus's voice broke the quiet in the living room as he turned to his dad. Chief Samuel Carter sighed deeply, his heart aching for his son. "Marcus," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Sometimes people judge others not for who they are, but because of their own fears and prejudices. It's unfair and it's wrong, but it's the reality we're working to change." He paused, meeting Marcus's gaze with a mixture of pride and sadness. "I need you to understand, son, you don't have to stay silent about what happened. Your story matters, and speaking up about it can help others who've been through the same thing." Marcus looked down at his hands, his emotions a tangled mess. "Do you really think I should tell people what happened?" he asked hesitantly. Chief Carter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I do. If you're ready, sharing your story can shine a light on these kinds of experiences. It's not just about you, Marcus. It's about making sure this doesn't keep happening to others. Sometimes, change starts with one voice." The words stayed with Marcus that night as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. A part of him wanted to bury the whole incident and forget it ever happened, but another part of him, the part his dad had inspired, felt a growing sense of responsibility. By morning, his mind was made up. The next day at school, Marcus stood in front of his friends during lunch, his hands sweating as he gripped the edge of the table. "I need to tell you all about something that happened to me," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. He recounted every detail, the street corner, the officers, the assumptions they made, and how it all made him feel. Some of his friends looked shocked, others nodded quietly, their own experiences reflected in Marcus's words. By the time he finished, the weight in his chest felt a little lighter. Word of Marcus's story spread quickly throughout the school and beyond. His teachers, classmates, and even people in the community started talking about it. The conversations weren't easy, but they were necessary. People began asking questions about fairness, about accountability, and about how they could do better as a community. Chief Carter, moved by his son's courage, took immediate action within the department. He organized a series of mandatory workshops focusing on empathy, active listening, and understanding the perspectives of the people they served. He brought in experts to lead discussions on bias and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. "These aren't just policies," Carter told his officers during one of the sessions. "This is about how we show up for the people we're sworn to protect. We're not just enforcers. We're members of this community." Meanwhile, Marcus found himself becoming something of an advocate. Teachers invited him to speak in their classrooms, and he even shared his story at a community meeting. Each time, the words flowed more easily, and he began to realize the power in his voice. He wasn't just telling his story, he was inspiring others to stand up, to question, and to demand better from those in positions of power. Months passed, and the changes in Crestwood were tangible. Officers were seen more often engaging with residents, playing basketball with kids, attending community events, and listening instead of judging. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One sunny afternoon, Marcus walked down the same Maplewood street where the incident had happened, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. This time, there were no stares, no questions, no suspicions. Just the sound of birds chirping and the steady rhythm of his footsteps. When he arrived at his grandmother's house, she greeted him with her usual warm smile. "You're making a difference, you know," she said as they sat on the porch. "What happened to you didn't break you. It made you stronger. And because of you, this neighborhood feels a little safer now." Marcus smiled, her words filling him with a sense of purpose. He knew there was still a long way to go, but he also knew that he had taken the first step toward a future where no one else would have to go through what he did. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Marcus felt a quiet resolve settle over him. Change wasn't just something he talked about anymore. It was something he lived. One step, one story, one voice at a time.